Supporting your ISMS. All right, so let's just quickly walk through clause 7. I don't expect you to become experts in this. This is really just an intro to what would need to be done here. I'm just going to put my aircon back on because my room's starting to get hot. So remember, I walked through quickly at a high level the titles. So let's just look at those in a little bit of detail. There's some detail there for you to read through, but let's just have a look at them just here. The first one is about resources. The standard essentially requires that you have sufficient, competent resources allocated to perform the jobs required in the ISMS. In other words, if you haven't allocated somebody to do a task, then it's potentially non-conformant with the standard. Now, you don't have to worry if conformance isn't your issue. So resourcing is determined by and supplied by senior leadership through budget, through organization charts and structure, and whatever other mechanisms you have in your agency that creates roles or whatever. You may want to put business case up to create resources, maybe. Staffing, who has what roles? Remember that diagram, table I showed on what are the roles people perform? That's an element here. But thinking about, and we'll see in a moment, training and competence. If I've allocated a junior staff to something, do they have the competence to perform the task is another question here. And lastly, budget. So from a resource perspective, do I have a budget for my ISMS? In other words, to keep the lights on for my ISMS. Do I need external support, consultants, advisors, whatever it might be, even control operators, if that's in the ISMS budget? I hope not. Maybe budget for the controls, procedural and technical. Maybe you want to look at whether that's a feature of your ISMS or it belongs to the business. And a budget for the monitoring, auditing, reporting elements that go with that governance cycle. So resources are all about, do you have the people available with sufficient and adequate time and ability to perform their task so that that is done effectively? One of the mechanisms we've done this, and to sort of spread the load, but also to share the joy. You can see they've all got happy faces there. To share the joy of ISMS is that we use this model called ISMS Champion or Process Champion. And that is where we go out into the business, and let's say my scope is multiple business areas. We would want the business leader in those business areas to allocate or take on, if they want to, the ISMS Process Champion role. In CommBank, I used to be a thing called the BISO, the Business Information Security Officer for our international banking operations in Indonesia and Hong Kong and the US and places like that. So my role, apart from my day job included liaison with the offshore banking functions and helping to roll out our security requirements, understand their risks and issues, as you can see on here. Act as a liaison for the ISMS back to the business, oversee maybe how they do stuff in the business, become competent, if you like, in all these things, maybe own their one-pager and keep it up to date, implement stuff like the treatment plan, getting them to own the treatment and corrective action and improvement plans so that it is not the obligation of the ISMS manager or the ISM or the CISO. Start to roll this and devolve this out so that the local business has visibility of their own stuff. They might monitor and report on performance measures. They might hopefully report and escalate, report or escalate incidents, events, problems, blah, back up to their line manager, but also maybe to the ISM. So deal with issues and problems and maybe become a bit of a conduit for this stuff. You still want incidents to be reported through incident management, but this might be something like an out of sequence notification. Hey, somebody's just reported an incident. Just thought I'd let you know so you can jump in and see what's going on. And hopefully in the end, maintain conformance with the requirements. So these process champions are very powerful. When I worked at Public Works and Services, or whatever it's called today, I set up security champions within various lines of business like New South Wales Supply, Asset.gov. The Valuer General function was in our agency, and each of Q Stores was there as well. Each of them had a security champion, and I would have maybe, I don't know, quarterly, maybe more often, I don't remember, meetings with them. We come together and we just go around the room. So how's things going? Any issues? What's coming up on the cycle for you? Where do you see the pain points? What can we improve? What do we need to do better? And, you know, sort of that info sharing. And it got really quite powerful. And these people, as you can tell by their smiley faces, these people felt quite chuffed because they got to do stuff which was a little outside their day job. They got better at doing something which was completely different to their norm. So these processes work quite well. A question, I guess, does anyone in there, I'm not looking at the chat box, I will now. Anyone out there got something like this already? Kind of a process champion or whatever you want to call it? Can't see any comments. All right. Maybe worth thinking about. And Kevin, did you have a comment?
Yeah, I was going to say there's been talk about community of practice variously, so that's sort of serving the same purpose.
Yeah, the community of practice is the agency representative coming together. I'm talking here about within your agency. Say at, I don't know, at DPAC, maybe the various business functions of DPAC have somebody who's embedded there, whose day job is that customer servicey thing, but who has a little part of their role that can help out with implementing security into their function. You might want to start small because you don't want to create a burden on them. This isn't intended to offload work to them. It's intended as, and this word here is what it's about, just simply for somebody to be a liaison and eyes and ears in the business function that can help alert, inform, improve the ISMS. So you do need to tread carefully, but that's kind of the idea. And the community of practice is the same thing, lifted up a level. Maybe you could implement it internally, call it a community of practice. Thanks for that. All right, now here's a tricky one, competence. You'll notice 7.2 is that people performing tasks under the ISMS must have competence is the standards requirement. Senior leadership determine what competencies are required, roles and responsibilities, for example. It's really around looking at, and Tristan, maybe you want to talk a little bit here about the SFIA. It's talking about, if you're at a junior level, what level of competence do you need to be able to do your job? And the higher up the level you go, the more your job changes from operational competence to management and oversight competence to governance competence, things like setting direction rather than following instructions. And so competence models are becoming quite useful. And Tristan, we've been exploring that SFIA model. Did you want to mention anything about that?
Yeah, I can briefly. Yeah, I'll just the Skills for Information Age is a international skills and competency framework that's used to measure, obviously more in the ICT world, but also has does also include the information security skills and competencies, and is actually the new Sophia 8 is mapped against the NICE framework as well, and so it gives you, as Gary described it, gives you that rating levels of different levels of skills and competency, but also a degree of autonomy and responsibility as well. So it captures that, and it brings together both your experience and your formal academic education as well, and industry certifications, and they have the ability to benchmark it at key points along the way. And so the idea is that people who are graduating out of uni or TAFE would come out entering into a level 3. So it's 7 levels of competency. So you enter into level 3, and someone who's been 5 years experience probably around the level 5 to 6, and CIO levels and CEOs are at that level 6 to 7. So that's the sort of range. But yeah, this ability to benchmark those through certifications. And there's a professional standard schemes as well that protect people working at that level. And so, and because it's international, it's transferable. Yeah, that's in a nutshell.
Thanks for that. And so we've been looking at that model for Tas government for this program of learning to try and make sure that when we do any of these sessions, like this one, this session's probably going from almost a level 1 or 2 or 3 up to about a 5 or a 6, maybe not quite getting to a 6, I would say. And so the goal in time will be to build out learning materials and training that is relevant for the various layers that people are at in their career or points they're at in their career, aligned with the SFIA, because it's quite well documented model. So we'll certainly be looking to do that going forward. And I put the name or the thing there, SFIA. I guess it's sfia.org or something like that to find it. But there's some good stuff out there. So essentially, competence is about that sort of uplift of people's capabilities to carry out their job. Keep that in mind. It should drive or could drive a training plan. HR you might want to talk to HR about qualifications. You know, do people need certain security related qualifications for jobs? Qualifications, certifications, accreditations, whatever the word is there that might be useful in your organization. And you should keep some kind of records. This domain lends itself to training plans and long-term succession planning and all of that stuff. But I'll just leave it at the fairly, basic level of, if you're going to do training, keep some kind of record so you know who's done what and who's on the path for more learning, what learning comes up, all of that. But Tristan and us are doing a little bit of work in this space to try and map that stuff out anyway. I've got an example here, a really basic one, and then on the next page a little bit more detailed, but they're both still fairly primitive. The kind of competencies for an ISMS, clauses 4 to 10 and annex, a governance type competence, particularly here about security and maybe about certification. Your governors need to know at a high level, what is the standard and how does that thing kind of work? And so what I've done here is, if this is a competence, who's affected and what kind of thing could we do or have we done already that might help them maintain that level of competence. And obviously this is pretty simple and basic. You could certainly flesh this out with far more detail on specific courses or whatever it might be. But the basic competence: governance, risk management competence, security management competence, business process and controls like IT operations and all of that. That's kind of an enormous one there. And lastly, the ability to audit it, particularly an ISMS audit competence. They're probably the main ones that come from an ISMS. Obviously, this one here is dependent on your scope. The bigger your scope, the more business processes and security controls and competence that respective staff need. But otherwise, the rest of this is reasonably simple. I've got a variation on that. I haven't done this implementation style myself, but you have a bunch of stakeholders and you have a bunch of competencies and maybe some levels that you might want them at, a little bit like SFIA, but this is probably precedes the SFIA, our use of it. But you can see here that there's kind of some ideas on what needs to be done. I noticed the leadership don't need anything, so maybe this is a work in progress. But there are ways and means for you to look at that and explore that without getting too onerous. Awareness, I don't want to overdo this one other than to say that you need to make sure there is a program of security awareness and training. In the clause 7.3, awareness is really only about awareness of the ISMS. In the annex, in the HR piece, at 722 to be precise, is a very specific call out that all users must have sufficient and adequate awareness for them to carry out their jobs. We've covered a little bit of both here. So however you want to do awareness, Awareness is fun. I do find presenting and training and lifting people's awareness to probably be the most rewarding piece of an ISMS, because if you do it well, people start to see how their own jobs can get better, and you can obviously use this process to uplift them just in home, security at home, and helping their own, family members, be it parents or children, in how to be secure, how to use the internet, how to use technology, all those things. So awareness, I do want to call out a few points here. The benefits: to raise awareness, to help people know what their roles are. If people don't know what they're supposed to do, no matter how skilled they are at awareness of general stuff, if they don't know their roles, that's tricky. And lastly, to handle things properly, incidents, concerns. So you want to be able to skill people to the point that if they have a problem that they've spotted, that it gets handled properly. Staff who lack awareness pose a risk. We hear that saying, I like to debunk it as a myth, but I'm going to just go through this for a moment, that people are your weakest link. I prefer to say that people whose managers have failed to train them might be the weakest link, but for me, the managers that don't train their staff and commit to their ongoing awareness in these three domains are probably worse than the staff who make the mistakes. That's kind of my view on that, because I want to hold somebody accountable. The last three bits here, bullet points: the goal of awareness is to change behaviors towards that intentional culture of security. Keep driving your awareness with the same messaging about where you are trying to go. What is the intentional culture? What are the attributes of an intentional culture? There's some guidance out there on the internet, and that phrase is kind of becoming more common. Osaka wrote a paper about a decade ago, which I contributed to, called Building a Security Awareness Culture, or something along those lines. So there is some guides. So awareness, change behaviors. Training is about skills. Education is about expertise and the ability to direct and lead. Not all of your people need to be educated. Some of them may do. Your network engineers, your systems, application systems development lead people probably need to be educated and have qualifications to be reasonably expert. Training, probably everybody needs some degree of training. Training like in how to deal with phishing, and awareness, how do I do my job? What's the day-to-day issues we face and how do I handle them? So there's a whole bunch you could do there around awareness. Communication, as I said, is just communicating with people about the ISMS. I might just move on from that. There's a range of things you might want to communicate on, some content, who owns that comms, who should receive it, how often might you do it, how will you do it? This can be a little overdone at times. I know this one for me, maybe even too much. You probably want to just do the basics here. Who's essential to communicate with, how often, and about what? Certainly your executives and your leadership team, which aren't in this one. They're probably here on management review with senior managers. But this kind of model lends itself to being a bit overdone if you just put too much into it. Given that it's got frequencies, it's also a candidate for putting into your ticketing system if that's how you want to do things. Just looking back here, it's really, what do you need to talk about, when, to whom, and how? And that's kind of the point of it. And lastly, documentation. I've said it before, you need some kind of document management system. Confluence works, but I have other clients. We use Confluence internally, but you could use, SharePoints or any other wiki, or intranet probably is fine. Any kind of document management system. You need regular review and maintenance. It needs to be available to relevant staff. You should have some kind of version management, dates and times, and there should be approval of documents. This last one, though, without approval, it has no authority. In government, there's probably a little bit more bureaucracy around the approval cycle, who can approve a policy and the processes that goes through. In private sector, a lot of this stuff is now much less bureaucratic, to the point where I've got clients where if you have write access in a Confluence page, you've got to prove access when you hit publish. And that works because they're wiki-based, they're agile, they're immediate. Somebody sees an error, they fix an error. You don't have this kind of wait 12 months for the collection of improvements to come through. Maybe there's a culture there you could modify as well, that some of this documentation must be changed at the moment it's wrong or out of date or inadequate. Just go change it. And Confluence and the rollback cycle and historying and all of that allows that to happen. So that might be one of those discussions with your leadership about, remember I said authorities? Who has authority here? Can I just edit this stuff? Is that okay? There are some things like risk method and policies that probably need senior level approval, and that probably means memos and, you know, all of that kind of stuff. But maybe you can move forward in some of those spaces as well. All right, here's a document set. So the framework document for your ISMS. You need to document your clause 4 to 10. You need your InfoSec policy and any supporting policies that go with it. And then you're going to have a whole bunch of other registers and whatever else goes with it. A risk register, the statement of applicability, the activities calendar, comms, these other registers, we'll talk about that right at the end as well. Any records. So all of this documentation needs management. Government agencies with records management, I would tap into the records management people and ask them, how can I keep this stuff? Maybe that's useful. They'll certainly see this as records required. In other words, these will be things that you need to keep in your record management system because you're obligated under your policy to have this stuff. So all of this stuff probably will fit under your records management requirements. Now I have this slide here, which is really ugly. I wasn't thinking maybe of going through it, but just looking at the time, I've got a little bit more time up my sleeve. For each of the clauses, there is some standard documents that you would expect to create and have, maybe some registers that go with them. And so this is basically the stuff we've been talking about already: competency registers and comms and awareness, competency records, etc. So, you know, if I look at an ISMS, there looks like a lot there, but it's probably not too bad, not too complex to keep it up to date.